Thanks everyone for coming to the Europe event and for joining us today on our very interesting panel about custody and regulation, which I'm excited to get into, especially on that specific point, which I'm sure our guests have a lot of stuff to speak about. So perhaps I'll give Courtney and Alex 30 seconds or so to get into maybe quick introductions about yourselves so that everyone knows who you are and your background. So I'll start with the person I haven't heard introduce themselves a million.
You have to indicate who that is. Toufic has heard mine. Have heard mine a few times.
Oh, guess that is me then. So I am Courtney. I've worked in the financial services space for a good part of 15 years, but only recently sashayed into the crypto space, heading up the MEX digital venture, which is backed by the broader multi-bank group, one of the largest financial derivative organizations. We're looking to, I guess, expand into the space because it is very clearly where opportunity is, and I think it's the way of the future. We've got an incredible team, both from the existing multi-bank team and some very impressive subject matter experts. So I feel like we're really one to watch in this space.
Cool. Thanks, Courtney. Alex.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alex, co-founder, CEO of KNOX Custody. We're on a mission to expand the amount of insurance capacity available to centralized custodians and private key managers. And in our own right, we operate a custodian that seeks to allow our customers to gain dedicated insurance coverage for their holdings. So today we hold Bitcoin on behalf of a number of customers who can, through us, purchase insurance coverage covering a wide span of risks. When we got started in the space, in our view, the insurance policies were not adequate to cover the kinds of risks that were resident in centralized custody systems. And step one was, let's get an objectively lower risk custodian up, and then from there see what it means to expand insurance capacity to be able to handle the amount of assets now held in centralized custody.
Great, thanks, Alex. So seeing that we're a small panel, I'll try to incite some debate, and I'll try to get maybe some interesting questions out of us and allow us to have just more of a conversation than a question and answer. I don't think anyone likes a question and answer. So feel free to jump in, ask questions. Hot takes are encouraged as well, so to stir debate. But I think I'll put my first question again to Courtney to get things kicked off. As this is a summit, particularly dealing with Europe, with a strong Canadian and North American kind of contingency here. A lot of times in the news, we don't really hear about the challenges that's happening in Australia with respect to cryptocurrency regulation, and for companies like yourself to be offering the products that you want to be offering. I think it would be benefit for us just from a cross-jurisdictional analysis to hear what the hell's going on in Australia, and just to
Look, Australia has a pretty admirable financial services regulatory regime, but it's really in its infancy when it comes to the regulation of crypto. We've really I guess, segregated the responsibility of the financial services regulator and the AML KYC screening kind of regulatory process. And I think that's where the regime is at, with a real heavy focus on the legitimacy of the transaction, not necessarily the financial service itself. I think that Australia is very palatable to the space, though, which is encouraging, because you've seen a lot of countries out and out ban it. And I think that's remiss of them to make such a huge call on, again, what I believe is the future. I think that Australia is again, a very small market when it comes to operatives, but there's some huge murmurs. And I think that given the flexibility of the reg regime at the moment and the relative ease of registration, the ongoing operative requirements are huge, but I think any business that has any respect for regulatory compliance can easily integrate into the regime here. And I think, again, we will see digital assets expand within Australia and see some notable players there, because if it follows suit of your atypical financial services regulating regime, it's one of the best in the world. Although a small country, it's certainly up with the times and well respected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So have we seen kind of the movement within Australia for instance, trading platforms that have to be registered as with some sort of dealer license, or has that not really taken shape?
Yeah, look, digital assets in themselves are not yet considered a financial service, but they are considered a financial product, right? So they're required to have AUSTRAC, which is the Australian Transaction Reporting Authority, a registration, and you're required to report your transactions and screen all of your customers, right? Which I think is the very baseline requirement. ASIC, which is the financial services regulator, will very soon, in my opinion, bring out a broad framework. But I think because the space is moving so quickly, regulators are largely playing catch up with the requirements because they're understanding a completely new financial product. And to get that expertise and to build out a framework which isn't riddled with holes is no mean feat. And I think Australia wouldn't want to fall flat on their face, if I can say that, and launch something that was unfinished. So I do think that we'll see regulation broaden, but I certainly don't think that they will quash the opportunity, because I think that even through the players that already exist in the Australian market, they know that it would be cutting themselves out of a huge potential.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's a bit of a different story than here in North America. We find if it seems that the regulators are definitely looking a little bit more favorably and openly to the actions, which I think everyone is, but in a certain varying degrees. Alex, do you have anything to add to that? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, Toufic, you and I speak about this at length, but Canada is to some degree willing to, I don't want to say fall flat on their face, but unfortunately, Canada was home to a lot of the biggest exchange losses, especially with Quadriga CX and some others. And so the regulators have responded a little bit forcefully, and we're yet to see how the dust will settle, but in many cases are making calls that a lot of legal firms are saying are without precedent, but we'll see how that shakes out.
Yeah, that's interesting how the Quadriga CX kind of just changed the whole mentality, and it's almost like the regulators in Canada have almost like a PTSD from it and are just kind of overly reacting to what had happened. Adds for a little bit of flavor. What do you think, Alex, would take the regulators to kind of maybe quell their nerves a little and not have their knee-jerk reaction to kind of try to over-regulate and extend their jurisdiction, and maybe quell this kind of general tendency that we're seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly what we're seeing, and this is a pattern that we're seeing play out and hopefully continues being the case. I think that was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but when they looked inward, they realized that they had no real oversight into many of the players within the system, and they've started doing the most basic, just asking questions and seeing who is acting responsibly. It's my hope that the various responsibly acting firms can point at one another, explain how they're working together, and explain how we're progressing as an industry, and that the regulators will be happy to apply, at least in the near term, a light touch and not cause a disturbance such that new entrants can't come to play.
Yeah, that's a great point. Courtney, do you think that's more kind of cooperation amongst the good actors, quote unquote, so to speak, and putting forward maybe a united front with some certain standards can prove beneficial not only in Canada but in other jurisdictions?
Yeah. Look, I do think that unfortunately this space has tended to have a bit of a cowboys and Indians land feel to it, perceptive for people that don't understand it. And I think regulators, again, are always one to react, because if they don't after a certain event, then it looks like they're too lax, but they generally can't get that stick yielded at the right sense, right? They overstep the mark rather than coming in where they should. I think regulators that engage in dialogue with the players in the space are the most progressive regulators they are, because they actually seek to understand and unify, because at the end of the day, regulators aren't anything without an industry to regulate, and we as operative players clearly have a benefit in operating within a regulated environment, because I think that is valued by the consumer, and I think it's even more valued as this space evolves, because you're seeing some landmark kills here, and I think that consumers are starting to see the benefit of dealing with regulated entities, or entities that operate within, I guess, reputable jurisdictions. I do think that, the industry as a whole has a responsibility almost to ensure that regulation, if it's being developed in its infancy, they really put forth at least an effort to liaise with regulators to ensure that at least there's some sort of push to make sure that it is a fair application of regulation, rather than something that squeezes the life out of an industry before it's really started.
Yeah, and maybe Alex, have you ever had any experience trying to convince the regulator of your opinion? I know you have some strong opinions, but
no, I mean, I think it's exactly as Courtney says. I think it's on us to make sure that we are communicating with them, and that they're communicating with us, and that they come to understand how everything is shaping up, and that we don't end up producing legislation that is injurious to the industry. And to Courtney's point, it is a bit of a ratchet mechanism. Once these laws are in place, it's very difficult to reverse. And so it's important that we don't be, as with regulators and others, be too heavy-handed in what we apply.
So Alex, we obviously know each other for a long time, and we had many debates on the subject. One of my favorite debates that I love is your case on why Bitcoin does not actually need to be held by a qualified custodian, or that actually a technology service provider doesn't need to be a qualified custodian and registered. Now, all disclaimers aside, that this is not legal advice, and just for your informational purposes only. Can you give us that case on why you think that Bitcoin custodians don't need to be regulated under the qualified custodian label?
Yeah, well, I think certainly under National Instruments 31103 and 81102, I wouldn't say, for example, 81102 makes it pretty clear that for publicly listed funds that are physically settled in Bitcoin, a qualified custodian is in fact necessary. I do believe that it is overstepping to start calling, Bitcoin held in centralized custody a security, as many of the regulators have started coming down with. I think perhaps to update Courtney, one of the movements post-Quadriga was really to say, well, the holding of Bitcoin with somebody such that you have the right to a withdrawal represents an investment contract, which represents a security, and that suddenly that is under the purview of the securities regulators. And so I do think that we should be, and this is perhaps a concrete example of where we should not be so heavy-handed. I would not say, for example, that a qualified custodian is not necessary under the National Instrument 81102 context, and I believe, even if I held that view, that nobody would agree. Besides just the regulators, the industry participants as well. But I do think we should be careful in not overburdening every player with securities regulation. And I think one of the most injurious points here is that it would stifle the entry of new market participants. So many of the exchanges and others who are now looking at this, they have the treasuries and war chests to fight and to be able to even get themselves up with the kind of regulatory sheen necessary, but it will prevent new entrants. And this is a kind of situation that you typically don't want to see in a nascent industry.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to that point in 1 second, but I do want to raise one member of our team who's been practicing securities law for about 30 years said that back in the 90s, they had a case as well on if you said, was the printer producing securities when you went to make the share certificates? There's actually a case in Canada about that, in which they obviously ruled not. It was an interesting case in which you can use analogously to our current context. And I've spoken to folks like Polymath who kind of hold that view, where they say, we're the printing of the share certificates and not actually the issuers of the securities per se. Though I do want to go back to your point that you made, because I think you made a really interesting point here, Alex, where, and I'll pose this to Courtney and we can come back to you on it, is do you think this regulatory burden is actually creating a high barrier to entry for kind of small actors? Because what we're seeing here in Canada is it's really only the wealthy and the large, such as the wealth simples and et cetera, that are really getting kind of this this treatment by the regulator, giving them exemptive relief and actually allowing them to operate the way others may want to. And this is creating kind of, an ability to stop maybe smaller actors from getting in. Do you see that as a problem? And how does maybe a person who's in that position as a smaller actor in the crowd, how do you think that they can kind of circumvent that or dampen its effects? I'll pose that to Courtney first.
Yeah, look, I think it's obviously operating in a regulated environment like Australia, it's onerous and it's expensive, and you certainly need to be adequately resourced to be able to really have a step in the door here. But I do think that is burdensome. However, I do believe that there is an intrinsic value to that, because I think, as we've seen regulators start to sanction players, it's almost like you're operating kind of on rocky ground if you don't have solid infrastructure before, because I think it's only a matter of time that it will be required. I do think that it would probably inhibit a number of players to enter, but I don't think there's anything wrong with having a benchmark, because I think that if we make the bar too low, then regulators are just going to probably start executing and making, when they do, set that bar, they'll set it way too high, which invariably will push the people out anyway. So I do, I have a real soft spot for regulation, because I think it's there for a purpose. I do believe that it can be overburdensome, but I think the key is operating within environments where regulators are palatable, where they don't, as Alex touched on, try to make square pegs fit in round holes by trying to make retrospective definitions fit a new era. So I think it's incumbent upon them to really evaluate this industry in its entirety standalone and not apply archaic financial services law to it. And I think that's a process, and I think that's a long time coming, but I do believe it's necessary to really see this space evolve.
Alex, do you hold that position, or are you a little bit?
Yeah, I think I hold a similar position, and I suppose Australia is fortunate to not have had the kind of incidents that Canada has had, I think. And this is perhaps a good lesson precisely for that point, that completely unregulated situations like Quadriga, where you can surmise that it was an outright scam, occurred. And then as a result, the regulators then need to launch a perhaps zealous response. And so had we had some oversight, or at least some inquiry into the various exchanges and other actors within the space, then perhaps the regulators could have seen that entities like Quadriga were not playing the same game that other far more responsible entities were playing. And we wouldn't have perhaps the kind of potentially overburdensome frameworks like the introduction of the notion of a CTP and other such points.
Yeah, and I think to add to that point, I think it allows for the serious actors to come out, and it kind of separates who's serious and looking to actually build a long-term business and who's actually looking to make maybe a quick buck, so to speak, and I think that allows people who are trying to be serious to actually put themselves apart and gives them potentially some market advantages vis-a-vis other participants. but sometimes it doesn't seem like it plans out, right? I would say that we have situations where certain people have spent much efforts and time and money into getting themselves regulated, and then they see stories like Binance posting 600 million, or what was it, 600 billion trades as in June of last year. It kind of creates a bit of dichotomy there. But maybe going to more of a fun point that I sometimes like to ask. So obviously we have serious actors, and then we have some not so serious actors. The not so serious actors sometimes are looked at through the lens of securities law and looked at through the lens through capital markets. But perhaps they should be looked at a different lens because they're not really investments and they're more like gambling. I'm speaking more about the pump and dumps. So, Alex, do you think we should legalize pump and dumps in the crypto sense?
I do not. Yeah, I do not believe we should legalize pump and dumps. And I think my view on various cryptocurrencies, most cryptocurrencies, frankly, besides Bitcoin, that represent attempts to garner a lot of retail money with no real intent to actually produce a return. And so this is, for better or worse, at least the ICO craze is to some degree behind us, but it is something that we should be wary of. And yeah, certainly I would not be on the side of let's make sure to legalize what is ultimately injurious to retail investors.
Courtney, do you hold that position?
Yeah, sentiment concurred. I just think, I believe that, I guess speaking to my point earlier, that the bar needs to be set at some level. Otherwise, we're never going to get out of the perceived view that it is something that is nothingness, that is not a viable financial investment. And I think that the negative media that goes around with some of these setups is a far more detrimental to this industry than beneficial. So certainly wouldn't be a fan.
Interesting viewpoint. Just to show the alternative viewpoint, I think looking at the pancake swaps and the poo coins from a gambling perspective rather than any type of investment perspective, I think sometimes looking through that lens might create another case for them. But I do generally agree with you both. But I'm just trying to get the hot takes out. Maybe final question I would ask is, what do you think would be some dark horse trends that are going to emerge in the next year or so from a regulatory standpoint, just kind of anywhere, whether your home jurisdiction in other countries? Interested to hear what you think is something that is not on people's radar and you think from a regulatory perspective should be on people's radar.
I think certainly, I can speak to Canada. I think we've talked at length about the kinds of situations we're seeing with various exchanges and others who are being faced with potentially overburdensome regulations. So I think that's certainly something that we should be careful of. Otherwise, and I suppose I always have to remind people that even though I run a custodian, I still believe in people holding their own keys for their own coins. And certainly a dangerous movement, should it ever occur, would be governments requiring people to not hold their own cryptocurrencies. So the notion that you should not be self-custodying is a dangerous one, I believe. And we are seeing some movements where there's perhaps too much oversight into what people's own holdings are.
Cool. Thanks. And Courtney?
Look, I think that the best thing any business can do that's coming into this space, or even pre-existing in this space, is really invest in infrastructure at the moment, because I think in most jurisdictions, you've got a clear indication now of whether the regulator is going to play ball with this sector or not. And I think it is only a matter of time in most of them that you are going to have those burdensome requirements inflicted if you're used to having nothing. I think that building out a framework now will ensure that you can withstand whatever storm, whether that be a regulatory interest or otherwise. And I think that really evaluating things like the partners you get involved with at this time, really articulating yourself with good counterparts, reputable counterparts, so then you can really prove that if you're ever called to action by a regulator or otherwise, that you're here to operate legitimately, regardless of whether there is a robust framework in place in the jurisdiction in which you're operating. I don't even believe that you need to be operating in a tier 1 jurisdiction to do that. I think you can be offshore and still do that. I think that there's an innate appreciation from regulators and consumers for a business that knows what they're doing and values what they're doing as a legitimate service.
Great, thanks, Courtney. I think we're out of time here, but yeah, I will leave it at that, as I think it was actually a good way to end it. Unless you guys have any final points or questions to be made. Maybe actually I'll let you guys plug yourselves a little, where people can find you on the socials or elsewhere, so that you can rest connected.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly feel free to visit knoxcustody.com. And if you need dedicated insurance for your Bitcoin holdings, that is the place to go.
And look, Mex Digital is developing one of the most progressive, integrated and regulated financial ecosystems. So keep an eye out for us. We're making stake.
Yeah, definitely excited to see where you guys both go. And yeah, on that note, I'll leave you guys, I guess, to your days. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you all at some other event. Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks.